Now, since portrait photography is such a broad topic, it's really useful to define some common terms people use when they talk about portraits. Now, the usual caveats apply here. One image can, of course, exist in more than one category, and these are just ways of labeling things. They're not set in stone. The only reason you really need to worry about this sort of thing is that it just helps to communicate clearly to everybody involved in a shoot, so yourself, the subject, or if you're a professional, somebody who's commissioning you to do a shoot. It helps that everybody understands the sort of thing you're talking about. So, you know, if somebody says, I'm after a corporate headshot, you all know broadly what you're talking about. The other catch, of course, is that what one person thinks of as, say, a beauty shot, somebody else might think of as glamour. What one person thinks of as an environmental portrait, somebody might think of as quite formal. So although these definitions can help a little bit, there's no harm at all in just communicating with somebody properly before the shoot, sending them sort of a mood board of ideas if needs be, or getting them to send you a mood board, so everybody involved knows what sort of images you're trying to get. So one at a time, here are some fairly common types of portraits you'll come across. First off is headshots or formal portraits. Now, these cover quite a wide range of shots, and they are usually fairly formal, fairly functional. Okay, think of them as basically a glorified version of what you'd have in a passport photo. They're the sort of thing you have for corporate headshots and the rest. They're fairly simple and straightforward. Okay, they're not the sort of thing you could be very experimental with. Next, you might come across close-ups. Now, in the film industry, a close-up is actually nowhere near as close as you might imagine, but in stills you can come pretty close in if you want. You can almost crop in just on a detail of somebody's face, and that's quite a close-up portrait. An environmental portrait refers to someone within their environment, so that the environment is as much a part of the image as they are. These are, of course, often used to tell a story or to put someone in their context. Quite a big topic next, and that is natural, candid, unstaged, reportage, lifestyle, documentary, lots and lots of labels that basically mean the same thing, which is that the subject in front of the camera almost looks as if they don't know the camera's there, and sometimes they don't know the camera's there, but often what you've actually done is create a situation where they can carry on with things normally and the camera just sort of observes them. So it's not a very staged presentation to camera, it's them going about their normal life or playing a sport or playing with toys or something, and the camera then just records them doing it. So it's natural, it's unstaged. Goes by lots of names though, that one, so that's well worth defining what people mean by that. Beauty and glamour, occasionally involving things like nudity. This, of course, this is something you'll be very, very careful with, because one person's beauty portrait is somebody else's sexy over-the-top glamour shot. A beauty portrait is one where, rather than any attempt to try and show off somebody's personality, you're really just concerned with exterior beauty. When you start drifting into areas of purely images for arousal in one form or other, you're not really in portrait territory anymore. You're in the area of sort of glamour, boudoir photography, that kind of thing. But a beauty portrait may not be particularly sexy or arousing, but it might not also tell you anything about the person's personality, just how pretty they are. What you often see as well are staged or action or performance pictures. Now, these, of course, very quickly start to sort of tread into the realms of sports or performance photography, but they often contain quite a large element of portraiture. If you're trying to capture a perfect shot of somebody performing their sport, dancing, or somebody doing something that they deeply love, and you're staging it, you're really going to great lengths to control every element so that everything looks just right, and you're capturing them at the peak of their performance, there's a great deal of portraiture element to that besides just the act they're doing. So it often comes within the remit of portraiture. Lastly, in terms of general portraits you might be asked to shoot or you might want to shoot, is of course group shots. A group shot very simply just means shots of more than one person. These of course can also be very formal. They can be team photos, or they can be quite relaxed. They can be for a band, for a group of some sort, where you want to sort of obviously establish a relationship between people, but you don't want everybody lined up like, like toy soldiers. So let's have a look at each style in turn in a bit more depth and see how you can approach them to try and get the best out of them, and also of course so you can understand what people mean when they use these terms. Now remember, none of these terms are set in stone. They've evolved over time. Different people have different labels for the same sort of thing, and the only real reason to kind of learn and get your head around these terms is so that you can communicate clearly between everybody else in the shoot. Don't get too hung up like if you get the labels wrong. It really doesn't matter, trust me. So our first category, let's talk about headshots, formal portraits, corporate shots, lots of labels for what is basically a nice, clean, simple portrait. Now, that's essentially what these are, nice and clean and simple. They are generally just for identification purposes. They are what people use as profile pictures. They're what people have on their LinkedIn profiles, their social media profiles. They're what they do on passes lots of the time. They're not the sort of place where you're going to be terribly experimental. You need to obviously be nice and clean and even with your lighting. This is not the place to have hard shadows and dramatic lighting. You need to flatter people, but there's no point being incredibly unrealistic. This is not the place where you would add whacking great chunks of retouching, because it would make people look very artificial. They do need to be to some degree realistic. Everything you do technically must of course work to this end. You generally want quite soft light. You'll want a sort of mid-range telephoto lens so that the shape of the head looks fairly flattering. You're not going to want extreme camera angles. You won't shoot from particularly high up or particularly low down. You won't shoot terribly close in. You'll generally be cropping sort of just top of the head to maybe mid-chest, maybe a little bit wider, occasionally a touch closer in. All the stuff I'm going to tell you about later about posing so that people look good, that's all going to come into effect. The one really sort of difficult challenge with these is that although they're very, very simple in execution, certainly once you've had a bit of practice and you've got the technical stuff nailed down, is that thing of basically making everybody look good. Because if you're asked to go and do an entire office full of corporate portraits of people for their internal memos, where it might be, or for their social media profiles, whatever their final use might be, you're going to have lots and lots of different people, probably not a great deal of time to spend. You may have 5 minutes with each person, 10 minutes with each person, and you've got to flatter each person, and there's a fairly decent chance each person will be quite different. You will have people of different heights, different builds. You will have people of different skin tones and different skin colours. You'll have people with glasses, without glasses, people with lots of hair, people who are bald, people who are extremely comfortable in front of the camera, and people who are not very comfortable in front of the camera. And you've got to make them all look good. Okay? We'll come on to later more of the sort of philosophy about what is a good portrait, whether it's the person who likes it or the photographer who likes it. But if you're doing something like a headshot, a formal shot, then ultimately the subject has to like it. If they're going to use it as their profile picture for a long time to come, they have to be happy with it. So you need to learn lots and lots of the techniques that are coming later about how to make anybody look good on camera. Because like I say, even though these are essentially very simple, they're the sort of thing that once you've got the technique down as a photographer, they're a bit boring really. They're very, very straightforward and they don't offer much excitement or creativity. But you have to get them right and people have to look good. Otherwise, yeah, they haven't really worked. Environmental portraits. Now, this covers an awful lot of different approaches. Essentially, an environmental portrait is a shot where the person is in an environment. Usually, of course, an environment that is sympathetic to them and is part of their story. But of course, you could just as easily play around with that and deliberately have somebody out of context, somebody in an environment that you wouldn't associate with them, just to make a point. Now, the exact balance between how much of the environment you show, how much of the person you show, is of course completely up to you. There is obviously a sort of a fine line where you can balance where you've got some emphasis mostly on the subject, but some of the environment behind them. The way this shot is framed, for example, you can tell that I'm in an office, but I wouldn't really class this as, well, it's obviously not a portrait, it's a video, but I wouldn't really class this as environmental per se. But if you pulled back wider and showed more of me in my context, you'd see the office is quite minimal and quite clean, and that might tell some story about me, that I'm maybe a bit anally retentive. But the degree to which you include lots of the environment or not much environment is totally up to you. All I would suggest is that you think carefully about it when you shoot, so that when the viewer comes to look at the picture, you're telling the right story. You don't include too much environment, not enough personal, the other way around, so that your viewer doesn't know where to settle their eye. Ideally, what you want is the environment in the picture that you choose to include supports the person. It's enough to tell their story, augment the story that is part of the picture, but it's not taking over completely. And that doesn't mean there's a perfect sort of set of only this, 1/3 person, 2/3 environment, or any such ratios. Sometimes you can do portraits whereby the person is very, very small in the frame and there's lots and lots of environment. That can work just as well as simply having a fairly close in shot, but just the hints of environment around them that give the impression that they are somewhere specific, that is obviously part of their story. Other ways you can adjust this balance are, of course, by using focus and using lighting. You can light the subject but not the rest of the environment, and you can play with the ratios so that the light on the subject helps to emphasize them out of their environment, but you don't completely lose them. The environment doesn't just go to darkness. Or you can use focus so that the focus is on the subject and the environment behind them drops out of focus. So there's still a suggestion of what it is, but it's not in pin sharp focus, so you can't see every single detail. And again, as with the earlier parts of this, you can play with those two variables to your heart's content. You can choose to have lots of environment, but it's a bit darker than the subject, it's a bit out of focus, or you can have the environment very bright around them, or you can have everything sharp from front to back to totally sort of locate your subject in their environment. Obviously, there are no hard and fast rules about this. This is a language that you're learning, all these different ways of telling this story, but an environmental portrait essentially means a person, a subject, in an environment, usually told to emphasize their story, but occasionally, of course, you can spin on its head and you can have them somewhere totally out of context. Another really big style of portrait photography is natural, candid, lifestyle, reportage, documentary. It's got lots and lots of labels, and what we're talking about here is a more relaxed style of photography. So the polar opposite to a corporate headshot where somebody is sitting very formally, here is me at my best, in my business suit, I'm having a corporate portrait done. We're talking about kids deeply engrossed in the games they're playing, or people, adults engaged in an activity whereby they're not particularly conscious the camera is there, and it may be that they're not conscious the camera is there. Now, of course, you can do this totally candid. You can shoot sort of true reportage whereby the people you're photographing don't know you're taking pictures at all, and so therefore their reactions are totally natural. Strictly speaking, I don't think that's actually a portrait. That does come under sort of reportage or documentary photography whereby you are an outside observer. A portrait, as I discussed in the introduction, a portrait means there's some kind of relationship between you and the subject. So this style of photography, what you often do is you engineer a situation whereby the subject can get on with what they're doing, or can forget that you're there, and then although they're aware they're being photographed at the back of their mind, hopefully it just stays at the back of their mind, and essentially they get on with what they're doing. Now, this can work for all sorts of subjects. It's great for sort of commercial and lifestyle photography, where you've got people looking as if they're enjoying something, they're having a lovely meal, they're walking in the hills, they're playing with their friends, wherever it might be. That often suits a much more relaxed, natural style. It can be brilliant for kids. Okay, kids, generally speaking, are not great at sitting and posing and staying still, but you'll get some great pictures of kids if you let kids play. And in fact, that's one of the best ways of doing kind of natural lifestyle photography, however you want to call it, which is just to create a scenario and then let them play, whether they're kids or adults. Just let them run with it and you'll capture much more natural reactions. On a technical side, that's also a big part of the picture. You are not going to get away with having precisely controlled lighting or very complicated technical things. What you'll need to be is very quick to react and fast moving, and adapt to the situations as they change. This isn't the sort of place where you'll have a formal lighting setup as you would with a corporate headshot or that sort of thing, or a close-up shot. You've got to be very flexible and very fast moving. Beauty portraits, or glamour shots as they're sometimes called, This is one that I would really suggest that if you're taking this sort of approach or people use this sort of language, you make sure both people understand what you're talking about. A beauty shot, as I understand it, as a professional commercial photographer, a beauty shot is concerned with beauty. I don't know why I'm pointing at myself, but I hope you understand what I mean. It's concerned with the exterior features of someone and making them look as beautiful as possible. Now, usually it applies to women and models, but it doesn't have to. And the sole point of it is to make somebody look their very, very, very best. You will often be recruiting hair and makeup artists. You will almost certainly be doing little bits of retouching, maybe quite a bit of retouching, but the idea is to produce a perfect, idealized, finished, beautiful image. Okay? It's not necessarily about getting across somebody's personality, which you might get, say, with an environmental portrait or a natural portrait. It's just concerned with that surface beauty. Now, why you have to be so careful here is that one person's beauty portrait is somebody else's glamour, sexy shot. Now, nothing wrong with either at all, but it's a good idea to understand that what your client wants is a beauty shot rather than what now gets called things like boudoir photography or, well, anything that's basically intended to arouse rather than just, oh, that's very pretty. Because, of course, if one of you is thinking one thing and the other of you is thinking something else, there could be all sorts of unpleasant confusions, let we say, if you rock up to a shoot expecting it to be very sexy and raunchy and instead they're just after a nice headshot, or vice versa. You know, I have had occasions where models have turned up expecting to do quite sexy stuff, and no, that's not what I'm here to shoot. You said beauty, not, you know, glamour or boudoir or whatever it may be. So make sure you understand what each party is looking for in this sort of thing, because yes, there can easily be some unpleasant confusions, let's say. On a technical level, you will need to light and shoot accordingly, of course. You'll need to shoot as flatteringly as possible, so your light will probably need to be quite soft, generally speaking. You can get away with harder light, but soft is generally more flattering. You'll want lenses that flatter the shape of the face and give a decent perspective. You'll want angles and posing that make somebody look their absolute best, all of which we're going to come on to later. But all of this, of course, is purely concerned with just the superficial element of beauty and making somebody look their absolute best. Now, action portraits, performance portraits, very staged portraits. This is another one where the definitions are very slippery. If you're taking a photograph of somebody performing something at the peak of their dance, whatever it may be, or generating a very elaborate set as somebody, you know, does something it's very complex and involves big movements and things, there's a lot of carryover into sports and action photography. You're capturing one moment and the whole thing can get very, very complex. The reason I often think of this as a portrait category is that it's what I've been asked to do a lot of the time, because lots of my background as a professional is in sports and fitness, and lots of the things I've been asked to get have technically been a sports performance, but there's often just one person involved and everything is being orchestrated and choreographed to that one perfect moment that I catch, and it's all about the person working at their peak. It's clearly not a reportage shot of them actually involved in the activity for real. It's clearly been constructed to make them look their best. Now, obviously, my background is in sports and fitness stuff, so I've got a tendency towards that kind of thing, but it could just as easily be somebody performing something, somebody doing a very elaborate setup of some sort, and you're simply catching it at its peak moment and showing them deeply engrossed in it. There are actually carryovers here towards sort of natural, candid lifestyle photography, because of course somebody should be deeply engrossed in what they're doing. You know, you're not really catching them sort of smiling at the camera as they jump through the air. They're often obviously deeply involved in the activity. So there's an element there that is, you know, candid and reportage. But where it stands out is that often you will have had to gone to great lengths to bring all the elements together, which may involve quite complicated lighting, lots of complicated technical stuff, so that you can record the action and the person at that perfect moment of peak performance. It's obviously a little hard, as I keep saying, to define when shots like this are a portrait shot or an action shot, but I find the best way to get it across is think of a movie scene or a scene in the theatre. That's obviously happening for real, live, in front of things, but everything has been choreographed for that to happen. You know, the actors are on stage performing for an audience. You know, the actors are in front of a camera on a film set doing things over and over again and getting them right, and everybody is there to capture that. There's no pretense that you're actually catching a real moment happening. You are creating this and orchestrating it yourself and directing it and choreographing the whole thing, which is why I think of these things as actually portraits. Okay, call them what you like. They don't really have a neat label, hence the problem of me having to describe them in enormous depth. But something that's big and choreographed, so as I mentioned earlier, the work of somebody like Annie Leibovitz or Art Streiber, where the image you're looking at is clearly very, very constructed. It's not accidental, it's not natural, it's a very, very big, elaborate production. I love these sort of shots, you can probably guess. They're very, very challenging, but they're also some of the most rewarding going. Close-up portraits. Now this is where things get a bit more creative. I would not suggest you try and get away with this, for example, in something like a corporate headshot or formal portrait, because when we talk about close-ups, we're talking about really quite tight in, okay? Sometimes so much so that you struggle to identify who the person is. Now, one of the big pluses to close-up photography is that it can be very, very dramatic, it can be very intense, it can create quite a memorable image. It's also really handy when you find yourself in a situation when you've got to do somebody's portrait, but the environment you're in is just horrible, and you've just got no other options as to where to shoot, or the lighting is really, really horrible, and so rather than have to include the grotty location behind you, you just choose, right, I'm going to come really, really close in and just exclude all that background. That's a trick I've done lots and lots of times. It's one of the reasons that, although I almost never use it for actual close-up product photography, I always have what's called a macro lens in the bag, which allows me to go very, very close in and still focus nice and close. Now the drawback with close-up images, you can probably guess, if you're getting very, very close into somebody, certainly nowadays with the incredibly high resolution cameras that we have, if they've got any flaws anywhere, and we've all got flaws, they're going to show up, and they're going to show up a lot, okay? Lots of people are quite conscious of how their skin is, or any tiny imperfections in their face, or wrinkles, or anything of the sort. And if you come in really, really close, you are going to exaggerate any of those flaws. So be very, very careful. It suits some subjects much better than others. It's one of those things that as I've done lots of times, it suits male subjects better than female subjects quite a lot, unless female have incredibly good complexion. Older blokes, for example, can get away with having craggy sort of features. It's just seen as, oh, it's just aging gracefully, and you can get away with that in a close-up. If you take, somebody female who's middle-aged and go very, very close in, they probably won't like you very much, okay, because it's probably not going to be that flattering. But used carefully, they can be really, really impressive. Okay, they're definitely a good tool to have in your arsenal, and I like to play around with them quite a lot. I find they're a really good way to get creative, because the human face, of course, it's probably our fascination with the human face that interests us about portraits, and close-ups are a great way to explore that. Okay, lastly, group shots. Now, things can get really technical here. Group shots covers quite a wide range of things, and if you need to photograph a large group of people, obviously a group shot technically is anything from 2 people upwards, but often when we think of group shots, we think of large numbers of people. Your main task is to make sure that everybody in the group can be seen clearly in the image. Okay, if you think of team photos, corporate shots, band photos, anything like that, wedding photos, for example, the idea is to record the fact that everybody is there. And that can be technically very, very challenging. On a technical level, a few key things to think about are, you may well want some form of height, whether that means the subjects want to be staged so that there are front rows, second rows, third rows, and they get higher so that you don't lose people behind each other. It also might mean height in regards to where you stand people. You might not want, obviously, tall people in front of small people because they'll hide the small people. It might mean height from your own point of view. It may be that there's no way you can stage loads of people, so the answer is if you stand them behind each other, but then you get above them, you can look down onto them. Okay, so height can definitely be your friend. Light with a group can be quite challenging, because unless you're doing something deliberately creative where you're allowed to play around quite a lot, what you need to make sure is that every single face is nice and evenly lit. And if you're trying to cover a large area, that can get very, very challenging. As you'll find out later on, I'm not going to go into enormous depth on lighting in this course because it isn't the place, and it's a whole rabbit hole to disappear down. I cover lots of it in the lighting course, which you can by all means go and take, and you'll learn everything you need to know about lighting. But the key thing with group shots is that everybody needs to be seen and lit evenly, and that can get quite complicated. Another technical thing that's really handy to do is, if at all possible, shoot a group shot from a tripod and don't move your camera as you shoot the shots. Okay, as you gather each image, don't move the camera, because then if you've got, say, 40 people and you've got 8 rows or whatever, however you arrange them or something like that, you can guarantee, and this is going to come up in my next point, you can guarantee that in each frame there's probably 1 or 2 people blinking or pulling funny expressions. If you've kept your camera on a tripod and you've what's called locked it off, so it hasn't moved from frame to frame to frame, you can very easily, in Photoshop or similar software, you can take the good heads from this shot and combine them with the good heads for that shot and bring them together and get one perfect shot with everybody looking at camera and everybody looking good. Okay, so one really useful trick is put your camera on a tripod and don't move it from frame to frame. The last little technical bit when it comes to shooting group shots is shoot lots. Way back at the dawn of time, I was taught some sort of maths about this, and I don't remember the formula, but essentially there is some maths at work along the lines of the more people there are, the more photos you need to take to have a fairly good chance that every single person has got their eyes open in one frame. There's no hard and fast rule about this. You could probably shoot 1,000 photos and you may still get, one person every single frame not looking. But your safety is to definitely shoot lots and lots of shots, because it increases your chances of getting images where everybody's got their eyes open. And of course nowadays with large memory cards and fast cameras, it's really not a problem to shoot lots and lots of shots. Back in the olden days with roll film or sheets of film, it was a different matter. But nowadays, no excuse not to shoot lots and lots of images. Now, lots of the suggestions and advice I'm going to come on to later about posing and interacting with your subject, they all still apply with group shots. They're just multiplied because you've got more people to worry about. Non-formal group shots can be a lot of fun. Essentially, the more people you have in front of the camera, the more fun you can have. And often when you let people play, all sorts of magic can happen, assuming they get along with each other. Some of the best inspiration you'll find for this are the classic Vanity Fair, either Hollywood issues or comedy issues or TV issues that they run once or twice a year with their huge multi-celebrity montages they make. They're very good sort of inspiration to work from. You've got lots and lots of different people in the shot, all fulfilling a specific different role. A beautiful level of production, which is worth bearing in mind because there'll be a whole team working to create that image. And what's also worth realising with images like that, inspirational though they are, is that what you may be seeing was not all taken at the same time. It may well be that what you're seeing is sort of 3 people taken on one day at one location and 3 people taken on another, and so on, all composited together. It's not really cheating, but as long as you're aware it happens, you won't be fooling yourself if you can't quite recreate it in the one day. One of the guidelines though with less formal shots is, of course, be less formal. An eternal secret of taking people's portraits and making them look good on camera is giving them something to do. Very few people will naturally behave in a relaxed and comfortable way in front of a camera, as we're going to come on to later with lots more advice about posing and the rest. And what you can do to help that is give them something to do. And this is easier when you've got a group, because of course you can have people reacting to each other. You can have them tussling with each other. They can both be working on the same piece of equipment. They can be, interacting with each other, chatting away or whatever it might be, and giving them something to do. Getting involved with somebody else will make them much less self-conscious and generally get a much better performance out of them. So one of the biggest things I can suggest for non-formal group shots, or even formal group shots that you're allowed to be a bit more relaxed with, is give people something to do and let them interact. Still worth bearing in mind that you want to make sure you can still see people clearly. If you let people get too carried away, you can have people's heads turned away, or they'll move out of the lighting, or whatever problem you might face. So make sure you can still see people clearly, but it's really helpful if you give people something to do, and better yet, let them interact with each other. It can make your group shots look much more interesting than just a row of people standing very stiffly staring at the camera. So just to quickly recap the types of portraits I've been talking about, please don't get hung up on these definitions. For one thing, these are my definitions. The next photographer along may call them something slightly or even quite distinctly different. There's no rules about them. There's nothing that says you must always shoot this type of shot this sort of way. They are only really there as an aid to communication. Definitions like this are there so that when you approach your subject, you both know the right sort of thing that you're aiming for. You're both on the same page. And it becomes even more important when you start to earn money out of the job and you've got a client in some form who is commissioning you to shoot a certain way. If the client says something like, I want a lifestyle image, you need to have a good idea of what they mean. And as I said at the beginning, if you're not sure, supply your client or your subject with the sort of images you're talking about, or get them to send you images so you both know what you mean when you use terms like I've just been discussing. Because it can be very difficult if you turn up expecting to do a certain type of shoot, a very formal shoot, let's say, and they want a much more relaxed air, or the other way around, or any combination of them. Okay, so like I say, you don't need to learn these definitions, you're not going to be tested on them, but having an idea of what people talk about when they talk about a formal headshot or a candid shot can be very, very helpful going forward.